Welcome back to Sissy Maya. Make sure to subscribe to our channel to never miss an update. Additionally, consider subscribing to my Patreon to get access to these features, and much more. The wooden bands encircling the top were painted white, while alternating bands on the sides sported a light orange hue. It resembled a typical wooden basket with wire handles, akin to an old apple or peach basket, manageable for one person to carry. Laden with standard office refuse like loose papers, it wasn't excessively heavy. "Charles, Terry, take this trash basket down to the incinerator, empty it, and return promptly. I have another task for you both," instructed Miss Nathanie. "Yes, Miss Nathanie," promptly responded my friend Alex on behalf of us both. Though we weren't keen on the chore, we had little choice. The sky held scattered clouds, the warmth of the day permeating. While others readied for a swim at the boathouse, Alex and I were tasked with disposing of Miss Nathanie's refuse. Upon our return from the incinerator and completion of her additional errand, the window for swimming would have passed. Alex understood this too, but Miss Nathanie was indifferent to our recreation, choosing us over others for the task. Alex edged me in age by a mere year or so, towering over me like most of the guys I knew. My head barely reached his shoulders, and that day, much like me, he was eager to return. Given his greater height, he strode ahead with a quicker pace. "Hurry up, Terry," he called out, noticing my lagging. "You wanna swim, right?" he questioned. "You're walking too fast," I retorted, irked by his impatience. Moments later, Alex, frustrated by my slow pace, gave the basket a tug, inadvertently ripping the handle from my grasp. Papers cascaded onto the ground in a messy heap. "You fool!" Alex exclaimed, his frustration evident. "Moron," he muttered, as we scrambled to gather the scattered papers and trash. We resumed our journey in silence, our annoyance simmering. He was irked by my sluggishness, while I resented his domineering behavior. Mostly, we were both frustrated knowing we'd miss out on swimming that day. The incinerator lay a distance from the main office, situated at the end of an old dirt road behind the girls' dormitory building. It had likely stood there for years, well known to all. While being tasked with trash duty was usually a welcomed escape, a chance for solitude, today was different. We begrudged the lost opportunity for swimming, Alex and I nursing our resentment. Someone had evidently visited before us, likely an hour or so earlier, as the small metal door retained considerable heat. Alex handed me a stick to pry it open. With some effort, I lifted the metal lever with the stick, causing the door to groan and squeal loudly. While there wasn't a blazing fire inside, the residual heat indicated recent use. "Fully open it," Alex urged from behind me, his voice unnecessarily loud. All right. With the door fully ajar, the intense heat washed over me. Stepping aside, I watched as Alex grabbed the basket and tossed its contents, including the papers, into the incinerator. "Why'd you do that, you fool?" I exclaimed, my frustration palpable. Alex looked puzzled, not comprehending my outcry. "Miss Nathanie wants her basket," I clarified, growing more agitated. Realizing his mistake, Alex swiftly retrieved the basket, spilling some papers in the process, and placed it outside the incinerator. "Come on, Terry," he half pleaded, "lend me a hand." We hastily collected as many papers as we could find for the second time, tossing them back into the incinerator. It took a while due to a slight breeze blowing some down near the nearby creek, but we managed to retrieve as many as possible before closing the incinerator door and making our way back to Miss Nathanie's office. I carried the empty basket on our return, thoughts of the mist swimming urging us to hasten along the old road in silence. I struggled to keep pace with Alex's brisk strides, though he eventually slowed down. When I caught up, I noticed a mischievous glint, almost a smile, on Alex's face. Perhaps he was relieved I remembered to return Miss Nathanie's basket instead of letting it burn. We both knew we'd be in trouble if that had happened. Without a word, he playfully tousled my hair, a gesture of gratitude. Unlike most of the older guys who sported crew cuts,
I preferred longer hair at my mom's insistence, enduring occasional teasing from peers. Alex's friends had nicknamed me Mop Top or compared me to a sister, but I shrugged it off, content with my hairstyle. Halfway to the girls' dormitory building, Alex took the basket from me. "I'll carry it," he insisted, brushing off the dirt it had accumulated from the incinerator and the ground outside it. "Hey, Alex, look," I called, pointing to the swings. "So," he replied, glancing at my gesture, already aware of what I was implying. "Those swings are for the girls, dummy," he retorted, continuing on his way. Disregarding Alex's calls, I headed to the swings regardless. There were about half a dozen of them, each with weathered wooden seats suspended by thick ropes tied to a tall metal pole standing 8 to 10 feet above the ground. Beyond the swings were 3 long wooden teeter-totters. "Come on, Terry," Alex urged. "Don't you want to swim?" he repeated when I didn't respond immediately. "Yeah, but I want to give these a try, just for a minute." "All right," I shouted back as I settled onto the nearest swing and began to push off. Knowing he couldn't dissuade me, Alex joined me, placing the empty basket down and taking a seat on the swing farthest from me. Soon, we were both enjoying ourselves, attempting to swing higher and higher. Alex excelled at it, quickly surpassing my abilities, so I abandoned the competition and simply relished the sensation of the wind rushing through my hair as I swung back and forth. I didn't notice her approach, nor did I hear her until she spoke. "And just what do you two think you are doing?" came a loud voice from behind us, startling both Alex and me. We struggled to halt our swinging and stand up, turning to face the source of the voice. It was Miss Johnson, the girls' dean. Towering over us like a formidable presence, she exuded an air of authority. Most of us boys had never met her, though we knew of her reputation as the strict overseer of the girls at the school. She was as imposing as she was feared, a figure rarely encountered up close until now. "I asked you both a question," she half-shouted, repeating, "Who gave you permission to play on the girls' swings?" We were clearly in trouble, and the realization sunk in quickly. The school strictly segregated boys and girls, except during class time. The playgrounds were designated for specific genders, and we knew we weren't supposed to be here. "Come with me," she commanded. I felt the urge to flee, mirroring Alex's likely inclination, but there was nowhere to escape. Miss Johnson gripped our arms firmly and began to lead us away. "Isn't that Miss Nathanie's?" she inquired as we passed by the basket. Without breaking her stride, she instructed Alex, who was closest, to pick it up. Like Alex, Miss Johnson walked briskly, and he easily matched her pace. I stumbled a few times, but Miss Johnson never released her grip on my arm or slowed down as she half-dragged me towards the girls' dormitory building, where her office was located. When we reached the front door, Miss Johnson let go of Alex's arm and directed him to open it. She maintained her tight hold on my arm, pulling me through the door right behind her. Neither of us had ventured into the girls' building before. Although newer than our own, it bore the same scent, likely due to the use of similar cleaning products. "Wait here, both of you," she instructed as we halted in front of a glass-enclosed office just inside the entrance. "Good afternoon, Miss Johnson," we heard several girls greet her in unison as she entered the office. Standing outside the office, Alex and I remained silent. We knew we were in trouble, anticipating whatever consequences awaited us. Miss Johnson didn't stay in the office long, emerging to snap at us, "Follow me," as she pointed down the dimly lit corridor to our left. "The last door on the right," she instructed, trailing closely behind us. Alex paused to retrieve the basket. "Leave it," she snapped. "You can collect it on your way back." As we proceeded down the corridor, I glanced back and noticed a girl's face peering from the office door behind us. "Keep your focus ahead," Miss Johnson commanded, and I complied, refraining from further glances. Despite our fear, neither Alex nor I uttered a word, and Miss Johnson remained silent as we reached the end of the dimly lit corridor. "Inside. Quickly. Move it," she barked, adopting a drill instructor-like tone as we reached the last door on the right. Alex opened it, and we entered with Miss Johnson right on our heels. She pressed against me as she reached over, flicking on the lights without looking, then closed the door behind us. Presumably her office, a large brown wooden desk occupied one side, while a long sofa adorned the other wall. A door to another room stood adjacent to the couch. "Get undressed," she ordered. Neither Alex nor I moved. "Remove both your shirts and pants," she commanded, her voice seething with anger. I couldn't fathom what I'd just heard. Was she serious? "You heard me," she snapped, her anger escalating. Perhaps accustomed to instant compliance, we could sense her genuine fury. A glance at Alex's face mirrored my own shock and bewilderment. What was her intention? Why were we being asked to undress in an office? Johnson remained stationary. Content with our compliance, she then proceeded to the door located just beyond the other side of the couch, opening it and entering the adjoining room. She emerged moments later, holding a woman's hairbrush with a long wooden handle. Just as Miss Johnson returned to the room, there was a light knock on the outer door to the office. "Come in," Miss Johnson called out, while Alex and I, having already finished undressing, stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, folding our shirts and pants. The situation was incredibly embarrassing. Two girls, both roughly our age and as tall as Alex, entered the room. Without a word, they approached Miss Johnson, standing beside her. Seeing us in her office, in our underwear, they both wore big smiles on their faces. Miss Johnson stood in silence for a moment or two, her arms folded across her chest. Then, without speaking, she gestured towards the two of us. I suppose the two girls, having likely encountered similar situations before, understood their purpose. Approaching me, one of the girls held what initially appeared to be a faded light blue shirt. She instructed me to raise my arms above my head. It wasn't until she shook out the garment and began to slide it over my arms that I grasped the situation. She completed the task swiftly and quietly, leaving me no opportunity to react. My arms were swiftly inserted into it, and it was pulled over my head in a blink. Before I realized, it was done, and I found myself unable to resist. The girl positioned me to fasten the buttons at the back near the neck. A dress was now adorning me, a light summer dress in a serene blue shade. It boasted short puffy sleeves with elasticized ruffles and a delicate lace trim encircling the bodice. The hemline appeared to rest midway between my knees and hips, typical of dresses designed for a cute, feminine look, desired by some. As one girl completed the transformation, dressing me in a manner that emphasized my femininity, Miss Johnson and another girl tended to Alex, who visibly displayed his embarrassment as he stood there clad in a light yellow and white gingham dress, similar to those worn by older girls at the school during summer. Like me, Alex seemed deeply humiliated as the girl behind him fastened the buttons of his dress and tied a bow at the back. His eyes, meeting mine, hinted at the verge of tears. "Such a charming sight, aren't you both?" Miss Johnson remarked with a touch of sarcasm as the two girls finished with us and directed us to face her. Returning to her side, Alex began to shed tears, unnoticed by Mrs. Johnson. "Now," Miss Johnson started, "what were you told by Miss Nathanie when she instructed you to dispose of that basket of rubbish in the incinerator?" Neither Alex nor I dared to respond, frozen in fear, immobilized by uncertainty. "She instructed you to return promptly, didn't she?" Miss Johnson directed her gaze towards me. "But you didn't adhere to that instruction, did you?" she continued, casting a peculiar smile towards Alex. Without awaiting a response, she proceeded, and given that all the girls, except for these two, she swiftly glanced left and right, are expected to be either upstairs attending sewing lessons or in art class, not playing on the swings, where I discovered the two of you, I will demonstrate the consequences for those who skip classes around here. "You," Miss Johnson commanded, pointing at me, "come here." Filled with fear, embarrassment, profound shame, and remorse, I complied slowly. Miss Johnson, having moved to her desk and cleared some items, awaited my approach. Standing before her, she glanced at me briefly before gesturing towards the large couch across the room, stating, "I believe it's time for you to be over my knees." It was among the most humiliating experiences of my entire life. The ordeal of being dressed like a sissy was already distressing enough, but with Miss Johnson seated at one end of the couch on the thickly padded armrest, I anticipated what was to come. Everyone present knew the inevitable. I was destined for a sissy's spanking, with Miss Johnson poised to administer it over her knee. As I approached her, she guided me across her lap, a combination of pushing and pulling. Resting there momentarily, I then felt a gentle tug on my dress as Miss Johnson pulled the hem up and over my back as far as it could reach. I couldn't see what she was doing, but when I felt Miss Johnson begin to pull my underpants down, I almost died from the humiliation. She didn't just pull them down a little bit, she pulled them all the way down to my knees, about as far down as I guess she could. Those swing sets where I found the two of you are for girls, and only the girls, and since you decided to skip your classes today, you will now find out what happens to disobedient girls. With her hand resting on the middle of my back to keep me in position over her lap, I sensed Miss Johnson shift slightly, then I heard it. And then I felt it. Initially, it was more of a shock, but the ensuing pain was searing. I squirmed and kicked, but despite her size and strength, Miss Johnson had complete control over me, holding me firmly in place. The second strike was even more intense than the first, significantly so. I cried out, promising not to repeat my actions, hoping for her to show mercy and cease the spanking. Rest assured, after I'm finished with you, you sissy, it will be a considerable amount of time before either you or your friend there entertain the thought of skipping classes again. Then came the third strike. It surpassed the intensity of the second, and the fourth was even harsher. I recall there being more, numerous strikes thereafter, but I swiftly lost count of how many times Miss Johnson disciplined me with her large hairbrush. By the time she finished and allowed me to stand, tears were streaming down my face. My backside felt ablaze, yet simultaneously numbness washed over it in waves. Though tears obscured my vision, standing before Miss Johnson, the short length of my dress allowed me to glimpse my underpants bunched up just above my knees. Miss Johnson permitted me to readjust them, a relief I eagerly welcomed. However, my memory fades after that moment, except for the sound of Alex receiving his punishment by the desk. Like me, Alex soon succumbed to tears, and I believe Miss Johnson disciplined him much more rigorously than she did me, as his behind was visibly crimson by the time she finished and allowed him to rise. As Alex pulled up his underpants, Miss Johnson, having tidied her skirt, instructed one of the girls to give that big sissy a tissue so she can dry her eyes and blow her nose. The taller girl handed him a tissue, and as Alex gradually stopped crying, Miss Johnson dismissed them both. "All right, you two may leave," she said. As they were about to exit, they glanced back at us, both wearing broad smiles. Like Alex, I was too overwhelmed to react, merely standing there. "Now, do you two understand the consequences for skipping classes around here? In a moment, you'll be escorted upstairs to resume your education for today," Miss Johnson informed us. Feeling too humiliated and ashamed to react, we remained frozen, unsure of what to say or do. We observed as Miss Johnson returned to her desk, restored everything to its previous state before Alex's punishment, and then proceeded to make a brief phone call, presumably to Miss Nathanie. The conversation was short, and Miss Johnson concluded it with, "I'll keep them here until close to supper time, then I'll bring them back over." Supper time? It wasn't even noon yet. With that, she hung up the phone and led us out of the office, retracing our steps down the corridor. Pausing at the office she had entered earlier, Miss Johnson instructed us to wait while she briefly returned inside. She emerged moments later, followed by one of the girls, who then departed down the corridor. "This way, girls," Miss Johnson directed, pushing us forward by our shoulders, urging us to walk ahead of her. Approaching the front of the building, just before reaching the exit, we turned and ascended the stairs. Throughout the journey, neither Alex nor I uttered a word, and Miss Johnson, trailing behind us, remained silent as well. On the second floor, midway down the lengthy corridor, where Miss Johnson led us, we both heard voices, the hum of sewing machines, and what seemed to be children enjoying themselves. In there, you two, Miss Johnson pointed to the spacious room with the open door on the left. We entered the rear of the room, bustling with girls seated at paired desks, totaling about 24 in the room, each equipped with a sewing machine. Similar to Alex, many of the girls were attired in dresses, ranging from light yellow, green, to blue, akin to the one I wore. Resembling Miss Johnson, the woman at the front of the room, who was approaching us, sported a white blouse and a short dark blue skirt, her reddish hair pulled tightly into a bun, mirroring Miss Johnson. Clearly, she was the instructor of the class. "I have another student for you, Miss Swinsey," Miss Johnson announced, gesturing towards Alex. A few of the girls turned around, prompting giggles, followed by the rest of the class turning to investigate the source of amusement. "That's enough, girls," Miss Swinsey intervened, clapping her hands to regain their attention and restore order. "Back to your sewing, girls," she instructed. Despite their efforts to stifle their laughter, most of the girls, covering their mouths, returned their focus to their sewing machines and ongoing projects. Miss Swinsey returned to us, engaging in a brief, subdued conversation with Miss Johnson. Following this, Miss Swinsey took Alex by the arm and guided him over to a girl situated near the center of the room, who had a sewing machine to herself, directing him to sit with her. I couldn't help but feel immense sympathy for him at that moment. He must have felt utterly humiliated and embarrassed beyond measure. "You, come with me," Miss Johnson directed, touching my shoulder to capture my attention. Leading me out of the room as if I were a child, she held my hand. Directly across the hall from the sewing room lay another chamber. Although the doors were shut, the noise emanating from within indicated a bustling crowd of children. Upon opening the door and ushering me inside, once more I found myself at the rear of a classroom, roughly the same size as the one Alex had been in, but this was not a sewing class, it was an art class specifically for young girls. Standing behind and leaning over two of the girls seated at the elongated table positioned in the room's center, the instructor, noticing our entrance, momentarily left the girls to approach us, prompted by Miss Johnson beckoning wave. Miss Mindy, nearly as tall as Miss Johnson and attired similarly, albeit considerably younger, possessed a slender and striking appearance. Her short brunette hairstyle bore a resemblance to mine, imparting a charming tomboy aura, while her warm smile suggested that despite the mandated dress code shared by everyone in the room, my time in art class with Miss Mindy might not be as daunting as Alex's sewing lessons. "And who do we have here?" she inquired, directing her attention towards me as she approached. "Tracy, I'd like to have this young lady remain in your class for the rest of the day. Can you accommodate that?" Miss Johnson queried, peering down at me. Miss Mindy paused for a moment, seemingly perplexed as she gazed at me. Perhaps my unisex hairstyle initially puzzled her. However, comprehension soon dawned, and as I met her gaze, I surmised that Miss Mindy could discern the evidence of recent tears on my face. "Oh, I see. I understand," she murmured softly, extending both hands towards me, which I accepted. "Certainly. We'd be delighted to welcome another aspiring artist into our group," she informed Miss Johnson with a wide smile, brimming with evident enthusiasm. "Excellent. Then I'll entrust this young lady to your care, Tracy. There's another student, an older one, in Miss Swinsey's room. At the conclusion of your class, if you could accompany this one over there to wait for me with Miss Swinsey, I'd appreciate it." "All right?" Miss Johnson inquired. Maintaining her gaze on me, Miss Mindy nodded in affirmation. With that, Miss Johnson turned and exited the room, closing the door behind her. "Well, honey," Miss Mindy began, attempting to be comforting, "what's your name?" "Terry," I replied, still feeling deeply embarrassed, on the verge of tears once more. "Terry? That's a lovely name," she remarked after a moment, then added, "What led to your punishment, Terry?" "We were playing on the girls' swings," I confessed, overwhelmed by self-pity, a sentiment evident to her. "I see," she said, releasing one of my hands. "I imagine you won't be doing that again, will you?" she asked, already anticipating my response. I simply shook my head, confirming her assumption. "Do you enjoy drawing or painting, Terry?" she asked, guiding me towards the end of the lengthy table in the room center, where a couple of girls were already seated and observing us. Yes, I replied truthfully. Drawing and painting had always been passions of mine, a fact she seemed to recognize from the sincerity in my response. Emily, Sophia, this is Terry. Miss Mindy introduced the two girls at the end of the table. Terry will be joining us today, so why don't you two show Terry what you're working on?
All right, girls.
Emily, though slightly younger than most girls in the sewing room across the corridor and not much taller than me, donned the same style of dress as they did, akin to the one Alex was made to wear. Glancing around, I noticed approximately half a dozen girls in the room, including Emily, dressed similarly. Sophia, barely reaching my shoulders, sported long brown hair tied at the sides with delicate pink ribbons into pigtails grazing her shoulders when she turned her head. Her dress resembled mine, albeit in a faded pink hue. Most of the girls in the class wore similar attire. There were around 30 of us, all clad in nearly identical, somewhat childlike dresses. Some were light green, tan, or yellow, while a few, like mine, were light blue. This standardized dress code likely facilitated quick identification by the teachers, distinguishing the older girls from the younger ones at a glance. Under Emily's guidance, acting more like an older sister, Sophia, and a few others, including myself, spent the remainder of the afternoon engaged in drawing and crafting cutouts, which we proudly displayed to Miss Mindy. When it came time to utilize watercolor paints, Emily, like the others, insisted on dressing me in a large smock to shield my dress from any potential paint splatters. Overall, we had a delightful time, and the afternoon seemed to pass swiftly. I wasn't aware of Alex's whereabouts during the remainder of the afternoon, but despite the initial shock of wearing a dress for the first time and enduring a spanking in Miss Johnson's office, thanks to Miss Mindy, Emily, and the other classmates I met that day in art class, it turned out to be quite enjoyable for me. As the 5 o'clock bell rang, like many others, I felt disappointed that the class had concluded. We all had a splendid time in Miss Mindy's class. After assisting me in removing the painter's smock and tidying up the room, the older girls, led by Emily, escorted the rest of the girls downstairs to the playground, a destination I was reluctant to visit. Instructing me to wait by her desk, Miss Mindy proceeded to organize some overlooked items before approaching me. Despite needing to look up at me, she stooped down, took my hands in hers, and asked, "Terry, darling, I observed you in class today, and it seemed like you enjoyed yourself. Did you?" Affirming that I did, Miss Mindy released my hands and, as she straightened the slightly twisted hem of my dress, remarked, "I'm pleased to hear you had a good time in my class. Your drawings were lovely, Terry. If you ever wish to return to my class, you're more than welcome," she said, standing up. As she took my hand, I began to ask but hesitated, "Miss Mindy?" "Yes, darling," she responded, pausing to allow me to finish my question, just as we were about to exit the room and cross the hall. "Miss Mindy," I ventured, my voice tinged with apprehension, "will I be required to wear a dress if I return to your class?" "Only if you wish to, honey," she replied in her familiar, soothing tone, a sound I always remembered. "Only if you wish to, honey." As Miss Mindy escorted me back across the corridor to Miss Swins's room, I noticed Alex standing alone at the back, appearing utterly dejected. It was evident that he had endured a challenging afternoon. "Hey, Alex." I greeted him with enthusiasm, withdrawing my hand from Miss Mindy's grasp and approaching him. "What's got you so cheery?" he retorted, his tone laced with bitterness. For a moment, I nearly forgot my surroundings and who I was. I wanted to regale Alex with tales of the delightful afternoon I had experienced. But reality quickly set in. As Miss Mindy bid me farewell, I waved back, longing to accompany her but knowing it was impossible. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Miss Swinsy observing us. She exchanged glances with Miss Mindy before turning her attention back to me, and a faint smile graced both their lips. "You two wait outside in the hall," Miss Swinsy instructed us, adding, "Miss Johnson will be along shortly to escort you both back to your respective places." Miss Johnson soon arrived and, after a brief exchange with Miss Swinsy, approached us. "All right, you two, Let's go see Miss Nathanie. She's waiting for us in her office. As we made our way back to the boys' dormitory, we encountered several older boys, and well before they reached us, one of the taller ones spotted Alex. "Hey, Alex." "Hi there, cutie," one of the older boys playfully called out. "Oh my, you just look adorable," the same individual shouted again, mimicking a high-pitched, exaggerated girl's voice, which elicited laughter from the rest. "We went swimming today. What were you up to? Sewing dresses or playing with your dolls all afternoon?" Another chimed in, sparking more laughter. "And the other one's a boy too," another voice joined in. "There are two of them. They're both sissies," he added, followed by more laughter. At that moment, Miss Johnson turned towards them. "This is what will happen to any of you if you're caught on the girls' side, playing on the swings," she asserted in a firm and commanding tone. They fell silent afterward, continuing on their way. As they passed us, there were some snickers, which I'm certain both Alex and Miss Johnson heard. Upon entering the building, Miss Johnson escorted us directly to Miss Nathanie's office, situated on the first floor. Handing over the small brown paper shopping bag she carried, Miss Johnson informed Miss Nathanie, "Here are the individuals I mentioned, along with their attire." Miss Nathanie regarded us momentarily. "Didn't I instruct you both to return promptly?" she queried, addressing us both. Neither of us responded. "I did, didn't I?" she reiterated, awaiting acknowledgement. "Yes, Miss Nathanie," we chorused, our voices resembling those of the girls Miss Johnson typically dealt with. "This is the consequence of disobeying instructions," she remarked, not anticipating a response. After a brief silence, she instructed us, "The two of you wait out in the corridor. I need to have a private discussion with Mrs. Johnson." We complied with her directive, and a minute or two later, Miss Johnson emerged. She glanced at us, offered a fleeting smile, but didn't address us. Without a word, she passed by and exited the building. Alex and I lingered outside Miss Nathanie's office until nearly dinner time. It might have been half an hour or a bit longer, but at times it felt interminable. Miss Nathanie left and returned a few times during our wait, but didn't acknowledge us. We stood there, hoping for some action that might end the embarrassment of our sissy attire. Several times, as they ran errands, some of our acquaintances passed by Miss Nathanie's office, subjecting us to more glances and humiliating jests. Finally, just before dinner, Miss Nathanie, who had been out on business, returned. She ushered us back into her office and returned our regular clothing, instructing us to change. Strangely, despite the relief of donning shorts again, and although I wouldn't admit it to Alex or anyone else, including Miss Nathanie, I felt reluctant to shed my dress. Alex, being nearer to Miss Nathanie and evidently more eager, received assistance with the buttons on his dress first. Meanwhile, as I struggled with mine, the phone on Miss Nathanie's desk rang. She spent a few minutes on the call, during which Alex completed his change. However, I still grappled with a couple of buttons, and with Alex unwilling to lend a hand, I had to wait until Miss Nathanie finished her call. Once she hung up, she dispatched Alex on an errand, and as he hurried out, he flung his yellow dress over a nearby chair. Eventually, Miss Nathanie approached me and aided in removing my dress. While I changed, she collected the dresses and began folding them. It took her as long to fold the dresses as it did for me to change. Afterward, she placed them in the same brown paper bag that Miss Johnson had used to transport our regular attire when she brought us back to Miss Nathanies' office. Now dressed, Miss Nathanie instructed me to return the bag and the two dresses to the girls' dormitory. Interestingly, on my way to the girls' dorm, when I was certain no one was nearby and after cautiously checking my surroundings, I halted several times to open the bag and gaze at the dress I had worn for most of the day. Neatly folded atop my friend Alex's dress, it still resembled more of a blouse, a shirt meant for a little girl. Although perplexing at the time, I found myself contemplating the idea of removing it from the bag and stashing it away so I wouldn't have to return it, perhaps to keep it for future wear. Unlike the other students in art class that day, I knew I wasn't a little girl. However, over the years, I sometimes entertained the fantasy that if, For any reason, Miss Nathanie or Miss Mindy required a young boy's assistance in art class, and if wearing a dress was part of the deal, I wanted it to be me.